Hey guys, tonight we begin with the discipline and unshakable misery of the Roman Legion, the elite war machine that conquered half the known world and gave us sandals, straight roads, and the subtle art of yelling in Latin while stabbing people. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you'd make it in the Roman Legion? Adorable. Truly. Like a kitten trying to file taxes. Before you could even dream of being skewered in battle, you had to make it through recruitment, Rome's version of a talent show, except the only talent they cared about was, does this man look like he can carry a small mule uphill while bleeding? Step 1. Present yourself to the recruiter. Shirt off, chest out, dreams high. The recruiter, he's seen 1,000 chests and isn't impressed. He checks your teeth, not to compliment your smile, but to make sure you can bite through hard bread without dying. Flat feet? Rejected. Chicken arms? Rejected. Visible fear of violence? Cute. Also rejected. Height mattered. Stamina mattered. Having a face that didn't scream, "Please don't hit me." Big bonus. If you made it past inspection, you were now considered fit, which in Roman terms meant unlikely to immediately perish. And yes, you had to swear an oath. Not to Rome itself, but to your commanding officer, who probably hadn't smiled since the last crucifixion. This oath was taken very seriously. If you broke it, you weren't grounded. You were whipped, stabbed, or decimated, which sounds like a cool battle move, but actually means your own unit beats you to death for team morale. Still in? Good. Now sign your name, trade your youth for a tunic, and prepare for the next 25 years of back pain, trench digging, and being shouted at by men with aggressively oiled moustaches. They called this an honor. Roman citizens lined up for it. Some were even excited. Adventure, they said. Glory, they said. Most of them didn't make it past their second sandal blister. And don't think citizenship made it easier. In fact, it made it mandatory. If you were the wrong combination of poor and Roman, congratulations. The Legion was your future, and your therapist. Of course, if you were not Roman, you could still join. They just called you an auxiliary, paid you less, and tossed you in the front line like a particularly nervous piece of meat. And that's just the application process. So you made it past recruitment. You're in. Hooray! Now the real fun begins. The systematic erasure of your identity. Forget your name. You're no longer Gaius or Titus or the guy with good abs. You are now simply Miles, Latin for soldier, or, more accurately, walking shovel with anxiety. Your new identity was wrapped in leather straps, brass plates, and the scent of whatever died in your boots last week. Your haircut? Standard issue bowl-shaped tragedy. Your clothes? One size fits none. Everyone dressed the same, marched the same, bled the same. You want to express yourself? Great. Try blinking in Morse code during inspection. The Legion didn't do fashion. It did uniformity. And your new best friends, 50 sweaty men in the same tunic, were just as miserable and interchangeable as you. Individuality was a threat. Uniqueness was suspicious. If you smiled too much, the centurion might assume you were plotting something. Or worse, enjoying yourself. You slept in a tent with 7 other soldiers, stacked together like overcooked lasagna noodles. If one snored, you all suffered. If one farted, you all reassessed your life choices. Oh, and about your gear, it wasn't optional. The gladius, short stabbing sword, scutum, giant shield, and pilum, throwing spear, weren't suggestions. You carried them everywhere, along with your cooking pot, pickaxe, spare sandals, and what remained of your enthusiasm. Your free time? You mean the 2 hours between digging a ditch and standing guard in the rain? Sure. Use it wisely. Maybe shine your armor, or cry quietly into your vinegar water. Discipline was not just enforced, it was practically a religion. If one man messed up, the whole unit was punished. This created what the Romans called cohesion, and what modern therapists call shared trauma. Want to speak your mind? That's adorable. Keep it to yourself unless you enjoy running laps in armor, while your centurion yells Latin insults about your mother. You weren't a man anymore. You were a cog in Rome's war machine, a machine that didn't tolerate rust, hesitation, or flair, especially flair. By the time they were done shaping you, even your own mother wouldn't recognize you, though she'd probably still ask why your tunic smelled like feet. Ah, yes, the centurion. Your commanding officer, life coach, disciplinary specialist, and part-time thundercloud. If you thought military life would be hard, just wait until you meet the man whose entire personality is made of gravel, scars, and yelling. The centurion wasn't just your superior, he was your spiritual crisis in human form. He'd typically be in his 30s or 40s, which in Roman years meant he was already halfway to sainthood, just for surviving this long. He bore the scars of every battle he ever screamed through and probably wore at least one ear as a necklace. His armor? More polished than your future. His temper? On a hair trigger, especially when someone sneezed during formation. A centurion didn't just train you. He broke you down and rebuilt you into a slightly more obedient version of yourself. You'd hear his voice more than your own thoughts. His favorite pastime? Screaming your full name, followed by instructions you didn't want to follow, like dig faster, march harder, or stop dying. He carried a vine staff, known as the vitis, which sounds poetic until you realize it existed solely to beat people. And he used it with the enthusiasm of someone working through unresolved childhood issues. Question his orders. You might end up cleaning latrines with your toothbrush, if toothbrushes existed. Disobey. Public flogging. Slack off. Your rations would mysteriously become lost. Make a joke. He'd make you dig a hole, bury your sense of humor in it, and then fill it back in. But credit where it's due. Centurions were terrifyingly competent. They led from the front in battle, first into danger, and last to retreat. If you were bleeding out in the mud, your centurion would either drag you to safety or yell at you until you stood back up out of guilt. To him, discipline was sacred, weakness was contagious, and comfort was for barbarians and poets. You didn't love your centurion, but you feared him, respected him, and probably had stress dreams about his sandals stomping toward you. In short, he was your boss, your nightmare, and your only hope of surviving long enough to get yelled at again tomorrow. So, you made it through the yelling, the swearing in, and the soul erasure. Welcome to camp life, the Roman Legion's version of a 5-star resort, assuming your idea of luxury includes dirt, sweat, and someone snoring directly into your eye socket. First thing to know, there is no such thing as free time. If you're not marching or fighting, you're digging. And if you're not digging, congratulations. You're building something that will need to be dug up later. A trench, a rampart, a wall, a ditch, another trench. The Romans were obsessed with earthworks, possibly because they knew one day historians would need something to talk about besides toga colours. Your day began at dawn, rudely awakened by a horn that sounded like optimism dying. Then you dressed. Tunic, sandals, armour, and reported for duty. You didn't clock in. You just showed up and hoped not to get stabbed with the Vites stick. Then came drills, endless drills, marching, turning, stabbing straw dummies with all the enthusiasm of someone filing taxes with a knife. Every movement had to be perfect, because sloppy formations got people killed. Or worse, noticed by the centurion. After that, construction. The camp had to be fortified every single night. Yes, even if you were just stopping for a snack. You and your fellow trench gremlins would grab shovels and start digging like your lives depended on it. Because they did. Meals? Picture this. Barley porridge that tastes like sadness, a bit of cheese that has personally offended your stomach, and sour wine diluted with water because hydration was a luxury and taste was a myth. Bathrooms? Communal trenches with sponges on sticks. That's all we're going to say about that. Evenings were spent maintaining gear, cleaning weapons, mending sandals, and trying not to cry where anyone could see you. If you were lucky, maybe a round of dice with the lads before collapsing into sleep on a straw mattress that smelled suspiciously like the guy who had it last. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort didn't exist. But blisters. Oh, blisters were abundant. This wasn't downtime. It was just not marching time. And even then, you still had to brace for the centurion's voice echoing across camp like a thunderclap. "Hey, you call that a tent?" If you thought being in the Roman Legion meant heroic battles and epic speeches, surprise. It mostly meant marching. A lot of it. So much, in fact, that by the end of your service, your feet would have opinions of their own, and none of them polite. A Roman legionary marched 20 to 30 kilometers a day, often in full gear, which, fun fact, weighed about 90 pounds, give or take your will to live. This included your armor, shield, sword, 2 spears, cloak, cooking gear, rations, tent poles, and whatever emotional baggage you carried from home. This was called the mule load, and you were the mule. The pace was brutal. It wasn't a casual stroll through the countryside. It was fast, rhythmic, and designed to weed out anyone who had the audacity to possess knees. Every mile, some poor soul would trip, fall behind, or suddenly remember they forgot to be born a senator's son. There were breaks, technically, short ones, just long enough to gulp water, shove down a handful of barley mush, and regret your life decisions. Then it was back to stomping down the Roman roads, which were famously straight because the generals thought turning was for cowards and philosophers. And yes, you were expected to build a fortified camp at the end of each day's march. That's right. March all day, then dig, hammer, and sweat through a construction project like a military-themed home renovation show. Except no one was winning a prize, and the only audience was your centurion, judging you silently with his arms crossed. Blisters? Common. Lost toenails? Almost a rite of passage. Comrades falling asleep while marching? Surprisingly frequent. If you tripped, you got yelled at. If you whined, you got mocked. If you tried to fake an injury, the medic would slap you with a sponge and send you right back. But the Romans didn't complain. Not because they were stoic, but because they were too out of breath. Complaining takes energy, and all of yours was being used to not collapse face first into the gravel. So, if you joined the Legion hoping for glory, just know you'd spend most of your time walking to where the glory was allegedly happening, and praying it hadn't left already. Congratulations. After marching for hours with a backpack heavier than your dignity, you've earned the right to train for the thing that will probably kill you. Combat training in the Roman Legion was where your dreams of glory went to die, preferably in a controlled environment, supervised by a man with a permanent frown and a stick. The first lesson, your beloved gladius, that short, stubby sword you imagined waving dramatically like a movie hero, was not for slashing. No, no. You stabbed with it, right into soft, squishy areas. The groin, prime target. Armpit, lovely. Neck, chef's kiss. Why? Because stabbing required less effort, made quicker kills, and didn't get your sword stuck in someone's ribcage like an amateur. The Romans were practical like that. Cold, efficient, and deeply unimpressed by flair. You practiced stabbing wooden dummies called pile, which were basically logs pretending to be barbarians, and you stabbed them a lot, over and over, until your shoulders ached, your palms bled, and your centurion muttered something about your poor wrist technique. Then came shield drills. The scutum was massive, almost a portable wall, and you were expected to use it like one, blocking, bashing, forming shield walls. It was all fun and games until someone took a corner to the nose and passed out into the mud. Sparring matches? Oh yes, you fought your fellow recruits with wooden swords and all the suppressed rage of someone who hadn't pooped in private for weeks. Injuries were common, teeth were optional, and if you got knocked down, your reward was a helpful lecture about how real enemies won't wait for you to stand back up, princess. You also trained with the pilum, the Roman throwing spear, a clever little stick designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back. Basically, it had one job: stab once, then retire, just like you wished you could. And remember, all this happened while wearing full gear, in the heat, with minimal water and maximum yelling. You trained every day because one day you'd be shipped off to Gaul or Dacia or some other place where the locals expressed hospitality with axes. After all the marching, the stabbing logs, and being insulted by your centurion's eyebrows, the day finally arrives. Your first real battle. Your nerves, shot. Your legs, jelly. Your undergarments. Let's not talk about that. The enemy stands across the field. Maybe it's some wild-haired Gauls screaming like they just stepped on a Lego, or Dacians with curved swords and a personal vendetta against helmets. Either way, they look terrifying. They smell like goats, and, fun twist, they hate you. Your centurion blows the whistle. You're expected to fall into perfect formation. Hold your shield like your life depends on it, because it does, and advance like you're not currently trying to remember if you updated your funeral instructions. The formation? The testudo, or tortoise. Shields on all sides, shields on top. It's meant to protect you from arrows. And it does. Mostly. It also turns you and your buddies into a giant, clanking metal sandwich. One that sweats. Arrows rain down. You hear thuds against shields, yells, and the occasional scream that says, "Oops, not quick enough." You're still advancing, one tight shuffle step at a time, praying to every god you can remember, including some you probably made up just now. Then, contact, screaming, clashing, chaos. Your training kicks in, sort of. You jab with your gladius, trying to find the soft bits between armor while simultaneously not getting stabbed in the face. The guy next to you falls. You don't have time to mourn, or blink, or breathe. The air is thick with dust, blood, and a growing awareness that this is nothing like the training dummy. The enemy is yelling things you don't understand, but the meaning is clear. They're not here to negotiate. Your centurion charges past you, bashing someone's skull like he's stirring porridge, and screams, "Keep formation!" Which is rich, considering you're currently trying not to be dismembered. After what feels like an hour, or a year, the horn blows again. Retreat, advance, you don't care. You're alive, which is more than you expected 15 minutes ago. And as you stumble back into the ranks, bloodied, exhausted, and slightly traumatized, you realize one thing. You'll have to do it all again tomorrow. So, you survived your first battle. Bravo. You didn't get decapitated, trampled, or mistaken for a javelin target. You're probably feeling pretty invincible right now, which is adorable. Because in the Roman Legion, the real danger begins after the fighting stops. Let's start with wounds. If you got stabbed, sliced, or lightly impaled, congratulations. You now get to experience Roman field medicine, which was essentially a combination of strong wine, prayers, and a man named Lucius, who once saw a bone and decided he was a surgeon now. If you were lucky, your wound was shallow, your medic was sober, and nobody dropped the cauterizing iron in the mud before using it on you. If not, well, let's just say your nickname would soon be Lefty. Then there were the diseases, which were less like background threats and more like enthusiastic participants in the Legion. Dysentery was a favorite. It spread through the camp like gossip, and before you knew it, half the cohort was sprinting to the latrines, while the other half lay groaning in a puddle of regret. Sanitation. Technically, it existed. Communal sponges were passed around like party favors, and no one really understood the concept of germs, probably because they were too busy dying from them. Malaria, typhoid, infected blisters, trench foot, and something suspicious growing on your tentmate's leg. All part of the experience. There were no sick days. Just, you'll march until you drop, and then we'll talk. Oh, and let's not forget parasites. Worms, lice, fleas. Your body was less a temple and more a bustling ecosystem. But say you did get a fever, or your arm turned purple, or your toenail tried to secede from your foot. You'd go to the Valetudinarium, the Legion's hospital. Sounds nice, right? It wasn't. It was mostly just beds, moaning, and a guy heating up the knife. And if your condition didn't improve within 3 days, you weren't ill anymore. You were dead weight, which meant you'd be quietly moved to the ditch and replaced by the next recruit wondering what that rash was. Let's say you overslept, or dropped your spear, or heaven forbid blinked during formation. What happens next? Pain. What happens is pain. The Roman Legion ran on discipline the way taverns ran on wine and poor decisions. Every rule had a punishment. Every punishment had a side of humiliation. And your centurion? He lived for it. You'd swear he trained harder to perfect his death stare than he ever did with a sword. First offense? Maybe a public beating. Just a casual flogging in front of your fellow soldiers. Like a violent team-building exercise. The lashes were delivered with a vitis, a vine stick that, fun fact, left welts in the shape of your dignity. Get caught sleeping during guard duty? That wasn't a slap on the wrist. That was death. Yes, actual execution. The Romans figured if you were tired enough to nap on watch, you were probably tired enough to not mind being stabbed. But the crown jewel of Roman punishment was the legendary decimation. Say your cohort retreated when it wasn't supposed to. Maybe you ran screaming from a battle instead of heroically dying like a proper citizen. The punishment? Your unit was divided into groups of 10, and each group had to draw lots. The unlucky one? Beaten to death by the other 9. You read that right. Your friends beat you to death. With clubs. Because you ran slightly faster than the guy next to you. Even minor offenses were treated like war crimes. Drop your helmet, run laps, insult your centurion, dig a ditch, then fill it, then dig it again, until either you passed out or he got bored. And if you dared complain, oh boy, you'd be on latrine duty so fast your sandals wouldn't touch the ground. Picture carrying buckets of liquid regret under the watchful eye of a man who hasn't smiled since the Republic fell. Why so harsh? Simple. The Romans believed fear built unity. A legion feared its centurion more than the enemy. And somehow that worked. Welcome to the Castra, your new home. It's like summer camp, but instead of marshmallows and friendship bracelets, you get gruel, calluses, and an underlying sense of doom. Your tent, made of leather and optimism, houses 8 grown men with swords, blisters, and wildly incompatible sleep schedules. The smell alone is a tactical weapon. If you ever imagined Roman legionaries as gleaming statues of discipline, one night in this tent will fix that. The bed? There isn't one. You sleep on the ground, cuddling your shield like a sad Roman teddy bear. And if it rains, well, your tent leaks. Because nothing says imperial glory like waking up soaked and spooning someone named Gaius. Then there's the food. The Roman diet in the field was a lovely cycle of barley porridge, hardtack, and more barley porridge, seasoned with whatever dirt, bugs, or shame blew in that day. Occasionally, if the gods were merciful or a chicken wandered into camp, you might get meat. But usually it was just chewy bread and sour wine that doubled as mouthwash and disinfectant. You'd think meal breaks would be a chance to relax. Wrong. You had to cook it yourself, using a communal fire and an iron pot that may or may not have last seen cleaning in the reign of Augustus. If you burned the food, joke's on you. It's somehow better that way. Daily chores were thrilling. Cleaning weapons, repairing roads, digging ditches, building palisades, hauling supplies. Basically, doing everything except relaxing. And the best part? You did all this after marching all day, training until your legs gave out, and avoiding whatever weird fungus your tent mate caught last week. Evenings were for lectio, reading scrolls? No. They were for watch duty, dice games that ended in fistfights, and the occasional bard playing the world's saddest flute. And don't forget the centurion's evening inspection, where he'd glare at your armor like it insulted his mother. Still, some grew fond of it. There was a rhythm to the misery, a camaraderie built from shared pain, mutual suffering, and laughing at the new guy who tried to bathe with cold vinegar. You've spent weeks believing you're the sword of civilization, the fist of order, the guy in sandals standing on the right side of history. Well, surprise. The enemy didn't get the memo. To them, you're not a hero. You're an invader, an armored tax collector with a pointy stick. You show up uninvited, burn the fields, insult their gods, and demand tribute while claiming it's all for the greater good. Somehow, they're not thrilled. Let's take the Gauls, for instance. To the Romans, they were barbarians with questionable hygiene and excessive mustaches. But to the Gauls, you were that obnoxious empire that showed up every few decades to liberate them into slavery, or the Germanic tribes. They didn't have fancy roads or togas, but they did have axes and an unshakable belief that you needed to die. They saw your shiny armor and formation drills and responded with bear pelts, primal screaming, and the kind of close-range violence that made even seasoned veterans reconsider their life choices. And don't forget the Parthians, who fought on horseback and specialized in shooting arrows while galloping away, a move that Romans considered both cowardly and unfair, mostly because it worked. The thing is, your enemies didn't just fight for survival. They fought for revenge. Their brothers, sons, and livestock were taken last time you came through, and they've had years to sharpen both their weapons and their grudges. They didn't fight in neat lines or follow your battle etiquette. They hid in forests, ambushed supply wagons, and stabbed you in the back when you were just trying to pee behind a tree. There were no rules, just rage, mud, and a very personal desire to see you disemboweled. And if you were captured, best not to think about it. Let's just say the enemy wasn't flipping through the Geneva Convention. You might be paraded around as a trophy, forced to dig your own grave, or sacrificed to a god with far too many antlers. So, while you imagined your enemies as savages, they imagined you as the monster, a marching symbol of oppression, arrogance, and really annoying marching songs. Turns out, history depends on who's writing it. After 25 years of marching, bleeding, sweating, and not dying, which is apparently considered an achievement, you finally make it to retirement. Or as the Romans called it, look who hasn't been stabbed yet. Let's start with the big dream. Land. Rome promised veterans a nice little farm somewhere on the frontier. A peaceful plot of dirt where you could grow olives, complain about the youth, and not get hit in the face with a javelin. Sounds great, right? Except that land was often in hostile territory, surrounded by locals who remember when you burned down their uncle's village. So your golden years might include a few bonus ambushes. Think of it as retirement, with cardio. Then there's the pension, or premia. A generous payout, assuming Rome had the money and your commander remembered to file the paperwork before dying in a swamp. If not, you might get paid in IOUs, pottery shards, or a firm handshake, and a reminder that glory is its own reward. Some veterans took their skills to the private sector, by which I mean being hired muscle for corrupt governors. Others became trainers, whipping new recruits into shape with the same love and tenderness they received back in the day. But many just kind of drifted off. The body was broken, the scars were plenty, and the night terrors of battle drums and screaming Gauls never quite went away. You could spot a retired legionary by the way he limped, squinted at the horizon, and instinctively built a ditch around his vegetable garden. And socially? Mixed bag. In some places you were respected, a walking relic of Roman strength. In others, you were that cranky old guy muttering about formation discipline at the market. But hey, you were alive. That already put you ahead of most. You'd survived countless battles, diseases, centurions, and the world's most judgmental sandals. And now, you got to yell at your grandchildren in Latin and maybe whittle a gladius out of wood. Life in the Roman Legion came with a lot of certainty, mostly about death. And when you're constantly staring mortality in the face, you develop a rich spiritual life, or at least a deeply paranoid one. The average legionary worshipped a whole Olympic stadium's worth of gods. You had Jupiter for thunder and authority, Mars for war, and Fortuna for when you really needed that javelin not to bounce off someone's helmet and impale your best friend again. But Roman religion wasn't just about worship. It was about micromanaging the cosmos, one tiny ritual at a time. You didn't just go into battle. You sacrificed an animal first, usually something fluffy and unlucky. If the priest poked around its liver and said, "Yep, that's a good-looking spleen," then congratulations. The gods were probably on your side. Probably. Legionaries also had their own protective deities. The genius of the legion was a kind of divine group mascot, except instead of a foam costume, he lived in a tiny shrine and judged your every move. Superstition, of course, filled in the gaps. You wouldn't dare put your left sandal on before your right. You wouldn't sharpen your sword on a bad omen day. And if a raven cawed while you were oiling your armor, you might as well dig your own grave and label it reserved. Dreams were taken very seriously. If you dreamed of fire, it meant triumph. If you dreamed of rats, it meant betrayal. If you dreamed of your centurion smiling, it meant you were already dead and just hadn't realized it yet. And don't get them started on omens. Birds flying the wrong way, thunder at an awkward time, someone sneezing 3 times in a row. all signs that Jupiter was bored and about to spice things up. Did all this devotion guarantee protection? No. But it made dying slightly less terrifying if you believed Mars had personally approved of your face getting axed off. And for some, that belief that the gods were watching gave them courage. For others, it just gave them one more reason to constantly look over their shoulder. Because in the Roman Legion, even the divine had a kill count. You didn't sign up for glory. You signed up because a recruiter promised bread, coin, and the vague chance of not starving. But once you were in, oh boy, you were now a cog in the Roman glory machine. If you survived a battle, don't expect a medal or a commemorative tunic. Instead, you got a speech, usually shouted from a makeshift platform by some general who only got dirt on his sandals once. When he tripped into his bathhouse, he'd bellow about valor and honor and the eternal greatness of Rome, while you tried not to vomit from blood loss or heat stroke. Your role in this was to cheer, nod, and definitely not mention that your best friend had his head replaced by a spear 5 minutes in. But back in Rome, different story. There, you were a hero, as long as someone else was telling it. Politicians loved using your suffering as a backdrop for their triumphs. Mosaics were commissioned, triumph arches were built, statues were sculpted, but rarely with your name on them. Maybe, just maybe, you'd be mentioned in a scroll if you did something truly legendary, like holding a bridge single-handedly or dying in an extremely poetic way. But more likely, you'd be lumped into the brave legionaries who made the ultimate sacrifice, right between a battle horse and a supply crate. Meanwhile, senators in purple sipped wine and bragged about how their cousin's cousin commanded your unit. That's how you became part of the legend, as a footnote to someone else's family tree. And the public? They adored stories of Roman victories, especially when narrated by poets who had never seen a battlefield. To them, your 3-day fight in the mud was a stirring tale of Roman might. They left out the dysentery, the screaming, and the part where your comrade tried to eat a belt out of desperation. So yes, you earned glory, but not for yourself, for the Republic, for the Empire, for the rich guy whose name would be carved in stone while yours was forgotten by lunchtime. Still, there was something noble in it, a kind of tragic immortality, the kind where you died a number, but Rome lived on. Venice in the mid-13th century was not a place for small ambitions. Its canals hummed with the chatter of traders, the clink of coin, and the scent of foreign spices that arrived from ports unknown. It was a republic built on commerce, and Marco Polo, born in 1254, was born into its merchant class like a duck into water. Only, unlike most ducks, Marco was destined to cross deserts. His father, Niccolo Polo, and uncle Maffeo were not your average merchants. They didn't peddle trinkets in the square or haggle with the local fishmonger. They were adventurers disguised in silk robes, men who had already vanished into the east once before Marco could even speak. By the time they returned to Venice in 1269, the boy had grown into a curious teen with wide eyes and questions that could sink a boat. When Marco finally met his father again, he wasn't welcomed with toys or bedtime stories. He was handed a destiny wrapped in camel skin and strange maps. Niccolo and Maffeo had been to the court of the Mongol emperor, Kublai Khan himself, and they were determined to return, this time bringing their bright-eyed son with them. Imagine that. You're 17 years old, you've barely left your city, and suddenly you're told, pack your things, we're walking to China. No boat, no safety net, just horses, heat, and hope. It was an odd decision. Marco wasn't trained in diplomacy. He wasn't an interpreter. He didn't even speak Mongolian. But what he had was something you can't teach in a schoolhouse: an unshakable curiosity and a knack for observing everything. And so, in 1271, Marco Polo walked out of Venice with his father and uncle at his side, heading east on a journey that would cover over 15,000 miles and take nearly a quarter of a century. They were not soldiers, they were not priests, they were merchants with a death wish, or visionaries, depending on how generous you're feeling. Venice had given him trade, the road would give him the world. The journey began with a blessing from the Pope. Literally. Before plunging into the unknown, the Polo family made a stop in Acre in the Holy Land to fetch sacred oil and letters for Kublai Khan from Pope Gregory X. Because apparently, if you're heading into the Mongol Empire, it's best to bring gifts, divine endorsement, and paperwork. After that detour, the real journey began. They travelled north into Armenia and Persia, lands where deserts stretched like punishment and the sun cooked you in your own robes. It wasn't just heat or sand they had to worry about. This was bandit country. If the terrain didn't break you, the humans would. Raiders roamed the mountains like wolves, eager to lighten your load, starting with your throat. Marco didn't just survive, he absorbed. Everywhere they went, he collected impressions like a sponge in a bazaar. He marveled at fire-worshipping Zoroastrians in Persia, sipped strange beverages, and learned how to read people who didn't speak his language. He was being quietly forged by experience, part merchant, part anthropologist, part survivor. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a tangled web of caravan trails, winding through heat-blasted plains, crumbling fortresses, and cities that rose from the dust like hallucinations. In places like Yazd and Balkh, Marco saw architecture that looked like it had been designed by wizards, bazaars filled with goods he'd never imagined, rhubarb, lapis lazuli, gunpowder, and camels. So many camels. Grumbling, farting, perpetually irritated camels, each one more stubborn than the last. If Marco had any romantic notions about adventure, they were quickly crushed under the grinding monotony of desert life, camel spit, and dysentery. Still, they pressed on, up through the Pamirs, the roof of the world, where altitude stole your breath and the wind howled like it was cursing your name. The air got thinner, and Marco grew leaner, but not softer. His resilience thickened like calluses on his hands. Months turned into years. By the time they approached the borders of Yuan China, Marco was no longer just a merchant's son. He was fluent in several languages, skilled in survival, and accustomed to the rhythms of a world that most Europeans didn't even believe existed. The boy from Venice was slowly becoming the man who would change how Europe saw the East. By the time Marco Polo reached the Mongol Empire's heartland, he was exhausted, sun-darkened, and, if we're being honest, probably smelled like a dead yak. But none of that mattered anymore, because ahead of him, in the grand city of Shangdu, lay the palace of Kublai Khan. This was not your average royal court. Forget European castles. This was a sprawling, luxurious complex made of marble halls and gold-laced silk tents, sitting like a jewel in the Mongolian wilderness. Guarded by elite warriors and filled with scholars, magicians, elephants, astronomers, and interpreters, it was more international airport than imperial palace. Kublai Khan was no ordinary emperor either. The grandson of Genghis Khan, he ruled over the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. And yet, he welcomed the Polo trio like old friends. Why? Because he loved information. He craved it the way a dragon craves treasure. And Marco had stories. The Khan took an instant liking to young Marco. Maybe it was his curiosity. Maybe it was the way he spoke about Persia, or India, or Armenian customs like he was reciting poetry. Whatever it was, Kublai saw potential and gave Marco a role in court. Just like that, a Venetian teenager became a trusted emissary in the most powerful court in the world. Marco didn't just sit around admiring carpets. The Khan sent him on missions all over China and beyond. He visited the provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, and even dipped into present-day Myanmar and Vietnam. Marco became the empire's eyes, ears, and sometimes mouth. He witnessed paper money being used like magic scrolls of economic power. He saw grand postal stations with fresh horses ready to go every 25 miles, basically the Amazon Prime of the 13th century. He walked through cities with millions of people, clean streets, and functioning sanitation. Meanwhile, back in Europe, people were still throwing chamber pots into alleyways. And Marco wrote it all down, mentally at least. His real writing would come much later. For now, he was just absorbing, recording not just geography and customs, but textures, colours, smells, and human behaviour. The Venetian merchant's son had entered the palace of the dragon and found not fear, but fascination. The longer Marco Polo stayed in the service of Kublai Khan, the more surreal and sophisticated the empire became. This wasn't the barbarian horde Europe whispered about over wine. No, this was an empire with silk robes, astronomical observatories, functioning bureaucracies, and cities that made Paris look like a soggy hamlet. Let's start with the capital, Khanbalik, now known as Beijing. Marco described it as a city so vast you could ride a horse through it for half a day and still not hit the palace. It had wide boulevards, organized markets, public granaries, and even neighborhood inspectors to report crimes. Europe, still blaming demons for bad harvests. Then there was the food. Marco tasted things that didn't exist in the Western imagination. Exotic fruits, rich sauces, fermented mare's milk, which he politely tolerated, and culinary innovations like noodles that suspiciously resembled what Italians would later call pasta. Coincidence? Historians argue. Marco just ate. But it wasn't all lavish feasts and sightseeing. He witnessed the Khan's justice system, brutally efficient. Thieves had their noses cut off. Corrupt officials were executed with theatrical flair. The Mongols didn't do second chances. But they also protected merchants and enforced religious tolerance. Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Taoist. It didn't matter, as long as you paid your taxes. Speaking of taxes, Marco was amazed by the empire's administration. Provinces were divided into districts, each with its own overseers, record keepers, and rotating officials to prevent corruption. Paper money was backed by gold and enforced by death. Try refusing a yuan bill, and you'd lose more than your wallet. Marco also described the Pony Express system of the Mongol postal network. Horse stations every 25 miles, stocked with supplies, food, and shelter. Couriers could cross the empire faster than any European monarch could send a message across his own backyard. But perhaps most astonishing was the multiculturalism. The Khan employed Persians, Arabs, Chinese, and even Europeans in his government. Everyone had a role. The only qualification? Usefulness. For Marco, this was a revelation. Europe was still locked in religious squabbles and feudalism. But here in the East, knowledge and efficiency reigned supreme. And the Khan, calm, calculated and curious, wasn't just a conqueror. He was an administrator, a visionary, and, in Marco's eyes, the most powerful man on earth. The boy from Venice had now seen a world his homeland couldn't even imagine. and he was just getting started. Marco Polo's role in Kublai Khan's court was never static. One day he was a diplomat sent to negotiate with rebellious vassals. The next, he was galloping off into the hills of Yunnan to report on mineral wealth or check in on tax collection. And sometimes, just sometimes, he was a spy, disguised in local garb, quietly noting who was loyal to the Khan and who wasn't. How exactly did a foreign teenager gain this much trust in the most powerful empire on Earth? It wasn't just luck. Marco had two superpowers: observation and storytelling. He could walk into a village, talk to farmers, examine their customs, sample their food, and return with a report that painted a picture so vivid it was as if the Khan had gone there himself. Marco didn't just collect facts, he collected atmospheres. He could describe how a man carried himself, how markets smelled at midday, or how the silk rustled in the governor's sleeves when he lied. The Khan valued this. Marco wasn't some stiff bureaucrat. He was a living scroll, part anthropologist, part court jester, part human GPS. It didn't hurt that he could charm a room. Despite being foreign, he had mastered enough Persian and Mongolian to make himself understood, and when words failed, his dramatic flair took over. He could mimic accents, describe monsters with such drama you'd swear they were real, and recount legends that made even hardened warriors lean in closer. But his travels weren't without danger. On one mission to India, Marco nearly died of a fever. On another, his caravan was attacked by mountain tribes. He was stabbed once, though not fatally, and once imprisoned for 2 weeks in a miscommunication that ended with him being fed chicken heads and goat milk until someone recognized his Mongol badge of passage. Still, he endured. He saw elephants paraded in jeweled armor, Hindu ascetics walking through fire, Tibetan sky burials that made his stomach churn, and southern lands so hot that eggs could allegedly cook in the sand. Through it all, Marco remained unshaken. Every encounter, every brush with death, every marvel, he banked it all in his mind, like a scribe writing in invisible ink. He didn't know it yet, but these stories of paper money, funeral birds, mountain demons, and silk cities would one day rattle the foundations of European understanding. By the early 1290s, Marco Polo had spent nearly 2 decades in the service of the Great Khan. He had travelled across mountains, deserts, jungles, and oceans, survived fevers, political intrigues, and more than one arrow aimed a little too close to the chest. But Venice was beginning to call him home, like an echo he couldn't ignore. Only there was one problem. Kublai Khan didn't want to let him go. The Khan, now aging and increasingly paranoid, had grown attached to Marco and the Polo family. They weren't just useful. They were part of his inner circle, trusted in ways few others were. Letting them leave felt like giving up his favourite chess pieces before the final round. But fate intervened, as it tends to do. A Persian prince needed an escort. His bride-to-be, a Mongol princess named Kokochin, was to be delivered by sea from China to Persia. The land route was too dangerous, and the journey required people the Khan could trust not to get lost, die, or accidentally start a war en route. Naturally, he tapped the Polos. This wasn't just an awkward family vacation. It was a logistical nightmare. A fleet of 14 ships, over 600 passengers, diplomats, priests, warriors, cooks, and one terrified teenage princess with the weight of dynastic alliance on her shoulders. They set sail from Quanzhou in 1292, and what followed was a slow-motion disaster. Storms tore apart the fleet, pirates circled, disease struck hard, killing most of the crew and passengers. Of the original 600 travellers, Only a couple dozen survived, including the Polos and the princess. When they finally limped into Hormuz nearly 2 years later, it was less of a diplomatic arrival and more of a haunted crawl. Still, mission accomplished. The princess was delivered. The prince was grateful. The Khan, back in China, would later die in 1294, never seeing his Venetian friend again. Now there was nothing stopping the Polos from going home. They didn't return in triumph. They returned in confusion. Venice was at war with Genoa. Nobody recognized them. Their clothes were foreign, their speech strange, their pockets full of gems sewn into hems. Locals whispered they were impostors or madmen. After 24 years of wonder, Marco Polo was finally home, and Europe had no idea what to do with him. You would think that after surviving deserts, Mongol politics, disease-ridden sea voyages, and enough palace drama to fill 10 lifetimes, Marco Polo would retire peacefully, sell some silk, and grow a nice Venetian beard. But no, he got himself thrown in jail. Shortly after his return, Venice went to war with its favorite enemy, Genoa. Marco, being a loyal Venetian citizen, joined the fight, because what better way to re-enter society than to immediately get caught in a naval battle? He was captured in 1298 and tossed into a Genoese prison, where fate finally handed him a quill, an audience, and a window to immortality. His cellmate was Rustichello de Pisa, a romance writer who'd spent his career penning chivalric tales about knights and dragons, basically the medieval version of a fantasy novelist. Marco started telling him about paper money, cities with 1 million people, flaming mountains, cannibals, and black stones that burned hotter than wood. Rustichello's jaw hit the floor. He pulled out ink and parchment. Say that again, slower. And so began the creation of Il Milione, the travels of Marco Polo. Marco dictated, Rustichello embellished. Together they spun a travelogue so bizarre, so breathtaking, that most Europeans couldn't tell if it was fact, fiction, or fever dream. Readers encountered wonders they'd never heard of. Paper currency, coal, porcelain, snow leopards, rhubarb as medicine, Buddhist temples, Siberian shamans, and palaces with walls made of gold. Marco described cities like Hangzhou and Kanbalik with such richness. It made European capitals look like hay piles with attitude, but the stories that stuck weren't always the true ones. He spoke of unicorns, likely rhinos, men with dog faces, probably misunderstood tribal tattoos, and giant birds that carried elephants into the sky. We'll chalk that up to poetic license. Was it all accurate? No. Was it all honest? Possibly. But it didn't matter. The book spread like wildfire, translated into multiple languages, copied by hand, and devoured by scholars, merchants, and dreamers across Europe. Most people in his time thought he was a liar or a lunatic, but one Genoese sailor, born decades later, would read his words, close the book, and mutter, "What if—" That sailor's name? Christopher Columbus. Marco Polo's jail cell bedtime stories had just changed the trajectory of the Western world. Marco Polo was a man ahead of his time. So far ahead, in fact, that most of his contemporaries thought he was full of it. Even after he returned to Venice, even after the travels of Marco Polo spread through Europe like wildfire, people struggled to believe him. He talked of cities bigger than any in Christendom, of stones that burned like fire, of black-skinned men and golden palaces, of people who bathed daily. That last one alone was enough to make medieval Europeans raise an eyebrow. Scholars debated whether he had actually travelled as far as he claimed. Some accused him of copying old Arab sources. Others insisted he'd never made it past Persia. After all, he rarely mentioned the Great Wall of China, and his descriptions of tea and chopsticks were suspiciously vague. But they missed the point. Marco wasn't writing a Lonely Planet guide. He was a merchant, a storyteller, and, most importantly, a man whose frame of reference was Venice, not a PhD in sinology. He recorded what he saw, what he remembered, and what dazzled him. And considering he had no camera, no notebooks, and was speaking from memory while rotting in a Genoese jail cell, we can cut him a little slack. Despite the skepticism, Marco Polo became famous in his lifetime. An odd kind of fame, more curiosity than celebration. People knew his name, but treated him like that uncle who swears he once saw a mermaid. Entertaining, sure. But let's not quote him at dinner. Still, the book endured. It was copied, translated, and passed from hand to hand. It entered the libraries of kings and merchants, churchmen and explorers. It planted seeds in minds that were just beginning to realize the world was bigger than their village. As Marco aged, he returned to his life as a merchant. He married, had 3 daughters, and ran his business quietly from Venice. But he never recanted his tales. In fact, on his deathbed in 1324, surrounded by priests urging him to confess and take back his lies, Marco Polo is said to have replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." It wasn't defiance, it was truth. Because how do you describe the vastness of the world to people who've never left their street? You don't. You write it down, send it out, and hope the future is listening. Marco Polo died quietly in 1324, but his story was only just beginning to travel. In the centuries that followed, the travels of Marco Polo became one of the most influential books in world history. It wasn't just a bestseller in the monastic scriptoria of Europe. It was a seed planted in the soil of imagination, geography, and ambition. Sailors, scholars, and emperors clutched his tales like blueprints for a world they couldn't yet reach. Cartographers pored over his words, translating stories into mountains and cities, some real, others imagined. Maps of Asia soon bore names like Cathay for China and Zipangu for Japan, lifted straight from Marco's dictations. In a world where much of the globe was blank parchment, he offered shape, colour, and substance, even if sometimes it was wildly off. And then there was that Genoese sailor. Christopher Columbus didn't just read the travels. He studied it, annotated it, slept with it by his bedside. When he set sail westward in 1492, he carried Marco's words with him, quite literally. Columbus believed he was reaching the east, that Marco described so vividly. Instead, he stumbled upon an entirely new world. In a strange twist, Marco Polo's imagination helped ignite a discovery he never predicted. But legacy isn't built on accuracy alone. It's built on impact. Marco's descriptions of unfamiliar religions, cultures, and peoples, though sometimes filtered through his European lens, were revolutionary. He introduced readers to the idea that the world was not just bigger, but smarter, richer, and more complicated than they'd been told in church sermons. He helped shatter the medieval belief that civilization stopped at the Alps. In doing so, he didn't just stretch the edges of maps, he stretched minds. Yes, there were critics. Later historians picked apart his omissions and embellishments. They questioned why he didn't mention the Great Wall, which to be fair wasn't exactly great yet, or why he exaggerated mythical beasts. But none of that erased the fact that he inspired generations to explore, question, and dream. Marco Polo wasn't just a traveller of roads, he was a traveller of thought. And in the grand arc of history, That might be the greatest journey of all. If you want to understand ancient Rome, don't start with the marble statues or the speeches in the Senate. Start with the street vendors. The real heartbeat of the empire wasn't echoing through the forum. It was sizzling in clay pots beside smoky alleyways, where the poor lined up with empty stomachs and a few coins. Most Romans lived in cramped apartment blocks called insulae. Think 5 stories of flammable wooden misery, no plumbing, no insulation, and most importantly, no kitchens. Cooking at home was a fire hazard, and frankly, a luxury for the wealthy. For everyone else, meals were sourced outside. That's where the thermopolia came in. These were Rome's answer to the modern fast food joint. Narrow, open-fronted stalls with massive stone counters built to hold sunken clay pots, each filled with something vaguely edible and usually steaming hot. Meat stews, lentils, beans, salted fish, boiled cabbage, mystery sausages soaked in garum. If it could be cooked, boiled, fried, or fermented, you could find it on the street, and you could smell it from across the suburra. Vendors shouted over each other, hawking specialties to slaves, soldiers, labourers, and anyone too poor or too smart to try cooking at home. A couple of bronze coins could get you a hearty meal, maybe a chickpea pancake, a fried dormouse, yes really, or flatbread smeared with honey and crushed herbs. And then there was garum. Oh, garum, the fish sauce that held the empire together. Made by fermenting fish guts in the sun until they liquefied into a brown, salty sludge, garum was poured on nearly everything. To Roman taste buds, it was liquid gold. To modern noses, it probably smelled like a mistake. But the thermopolia weren't just about food. They were places of gossip, gambling, and human traffic. Hungry mouths mingled with whispers of politics, crime, and scandal. Gladiators might eat beside merchants, freedmen beside thieves. In Rome, your social rank might limit where you dined formally, but out here, hunger was the great equalizer. To understand how Romans really lived, you don't need scrolls or sculptures. You need to hear the bubbling of stew, the scrape of a ladle, and the curse of a cook chasing a kid who just stole a fig. This was the belly of the empire, and it was always rumbling. If you time-traveled to a Roman neighborhood around midday, chances are the first thing you'd notice was the noise, and then the smell. Smoke, fish sauce, spices, sweat, and bread. The city wasn't built on bread and circuses. It ran on lentils and deep fryers. Enter the Thermopolium, Rome's go-to food stall for the common man. These weren't restaurants in the modern sense. They were small, fast, and everywhere. Archaeologists have uncovered over 150 in Pompeii alone, complete with counters embedded with deep-set dolia, large clay jars where hot food was kept simmering and semi-sanitary. Most thermopolia were built right into the street front of apartment blocks. You walked up, leaned against the counter, and pointed at something that looked less terrifying than the rest. The owner, or more often, a family-run staff, would scoop your food into a bowl, usually with a warning not to ask what's in it. The menu? Utterly Roman. You could get pulse, a sort of grain porridge, dressed up with anything from honey to bits of leftover meat. There were lentil and chickpea stews, boiled cabbage, grilled fish, and for the brave, sausages swimming in garum, the ever-present fish sauce that made everything taste intense. If you were lucky, there'd be fried cheese or pastries sweetened with dates and sesame. For working-class Romans, the Thermopolium was part convenience store, part cafeteria, part social network. You didn't go there just to eat. You went to hear the news, complain about taxes, argue about gladiator fights, and maybe bribe someone. Roman graffiti often mentions these places by name, praising the food or insulting the owners. One scribble from Pompeii reads, "I screwed the barmaid at the inn." So, Yelp reviews haven't changed much. And yes, there were drinks. Mulsum, a cheap mix of wine and honey, was common, along with watered-down vinegar called posca, popular with soldiers and masochists. The elite, of course, turned their noses up at all of this. They considered Thermopolia dirty, chaotic, and low class. But they also never had to fight over a piece of warm flatbread at midnight after a public festival. For the average Roman, these stalls were lifelines. Cheap, hot, fast. Rome's answer to McDonald's wasn't golden arches. It was a steaming pot of bean stew in a terracotta bowl. When you picture Roman cuisine, maybe you imagine reclining senators nibbling roasted peacock or slurping oysters from silver trays. That did happen if you were rich, powerful, and constantly trying to outdo your neighbors. But if you were poor, which most Romans were, your diet looked very different. Less peacock, more porridge. A lot more porridge. The daily grind began with a grind, literally. Poor Romans ate pulse, a mushy barley or wheat porridge that was as flexible as it was flavourless. On lucky days it might be dressed up with olive oil, bits of garlic or chickpeas. On unlucky days it was just hot grain paste, the Roman equivalent of sad oatmeal. Street food was how the poor escaped the monotony. Chickpea pancakes, panis sicaris, were a hit. Cheap, filling, and protein-packed. Flatbreads baked over coals were everywhere, usually sold plain or smeared with garum, that omnipresent fermented fish sauce. It was the ketchup of the Roman underclass, only fishier, saltier, and more divisive than pineapple on pizza. If you had a bit more coin, you might score some boiled vegetables, usually leeks, onions, or cabbage. Meat was rare and not always, let's say, fresh. The street stalls sold sausages, but no one asked what was in them. If you found a chunk of real beef or pork, congratulations. You were either lucky or in the process of being scammed. Fava beans were common. Lentils were everywhere. Fish, dried, smoked, or salted, was a frequent protein, but rarely the good kind. Think anchovies left out in the sun for a week. Still, to a Roman labourer sweating under the sun, a warm bowl of lentil stew and some flatbread was heaven. Sweets were a luxury, but they existed. Vendors sold date cakes, honey-drenched fritters, and mustasai. Cookies made with grape must and sesame. It wasn't much, but after a long shift hauling bricks or sweeping streets, it was enough to make a man believe in the gods. And drinks? Water was unreliable. Poor Romans usually drank watered-down wine or posca, a sour vinegar concoction that sounds like punishment, but was oddly refreshing in the summer heat. For the working poor, survival wasn't about decadence. It was about what could fill a stomach, cost less than a coin, and not kill you. Street food, in all its smoky, fishy glory, did the job. If there's one ingredient that defined Roman street food and made modern noses twitch, it's garum. This wasn't just a condiment. It was a national obsession, a culinary status symbol, and quite possibly a public health menace wrapped in a clay jug. So, what exactly was garum? In short, fermented fish guts. Take a pile of anchovies or mackerel trimmings, mix them with salt, leave them out in the blazing sun for weeks or even months, and wait until they liquefy into a golden brown sludge. Strain out the bones, bottle the goo, and voila, garum. Rome's most prized export. Also a war crime in a bottle depending on who you ask. To the Romans, garum was magic. It added umami before that word even existed. It went on everything: porridge, stew, sausages, vegetables, even fruit. There were different grades too. The fancy, clear liquamen reserved for upper-class tables, and the thick, murky dregs, alec, used in street stalls and slums. It was expensive. The good stuff could cost more than wine. Elite garum came from places like Pompeii or Hispania, where entire coastal towns were devoted to producing vats of the stuff. These weren't backyard operations either. They were massive industrial centres, with clay amphorae stacked high and fishy vapour poisoning the air for miles. But the poor didn't care about provenance. On the street, garum was the great equaliser, slopped onto lentils, stirred into chickpeas, smeared on bread. It made bland food bearable and gave street vendors a powerful tool to mask, let's say, inconsistent freshness. It was also Rome's version of soy sauce or ketchup. Every thermopolium had its own secret garum mix. Some were herby, others spicy, and a few probably illegal under modern food safety laws. People even drank diluted garum as a hangover cure, which says a lot about both Roman drinking habits and Roman stomachs. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Seneca, the philosopher, once called it a costly condiment for the reckless. Others just called it disgusting. But despite its smell and mystery, garum was Rome's flavour. It fed armies, seasoned emperors' feasts, and clung to every sausage sizzling on every street corner. Garum wasn't just food, it was identity, served with a ladle and an odour you'd never forget. Fast food didn't start with burgers and drive-thrus. In Rome, the concept of grab and go was alive and well, minus the paper napkins. The city thrived on movement, and so did its appetite. For the millions who walked its crowded streets, worked long hours, and had zero time to recline on couches like senators, the street food stall wasn't just a place to eat, it was a pit stop in a daily marathon. One of the most popular on-the-go snacks, pulsed chickpea fritters. Hot, crispy on the outside, soft inside, and sold by the handful. Cheap, protein-packed, and blessedly vegetarian. Not that anyone in the Subura was worrying about cholesterol. Flatbreads were everywhere. Sold by the slice or as whole discs, they could be eaten plain, rubbed with garlic, or smeared with olive paste or leftover stew. Some were flavoured with honey and herbs. Others were just carbs in their purest, most portable form, perfect for workers who needed calories, not conversation. Then there were stuffed pastries. Some were sweet, filled with dates, nuts, and honey. Others were savoury, packed with mashed lentils, boiled eggs, or even fish paste. Think of them as the Roman version of a hot pocket, only made with love and absolutely no food safety regulation. Cheese also made regular appearances. Vendors sold chunks of aged sheep cheese that were dry enough to survive the Roman sun. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies and paired nicely with wine or desperation. And speaking of wine, yes, people drank on the go. Mixed with water or honey, and sometimes heated, wine was sold in cups from stalls or mobile vendors carrying skin pouches. Mulsum, the sweetened variety, was especially popular among workers and anyone trying to drown the taste of a suspicious sausage. Don't forget fruit. Fresh figs, grapes, and olives were easy to carry and could be bought from street peddlers shouting their wares over the chaos. In cooler seasons, roasted chestnuts were a warm favourite, simple, hearty, and perfect for chewing while walking past angry goats and loose chickens. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't curated, but it was fast, cheap, and fed a city of 1 million. Rome ran on garum, bread, and hustle, and the street food vendors kept the engine roaring. In Rome, what you ate, and where you ate it, was practically a class badge. Street food was never just about filling your belly. It was a daily ritual that revealed your rank, your income, and how close you were to dying of a tapeworm. For the working poor, thermopolia was salvation. You didn't have a kitchen in your crumbling insula, and even if you did, it was a fire hazard, and the rats had already claimed it. So you stood elbow to elbow with the masses, handing over a few asses, small bronze coins, for a scoop of lentils or a chunk of greasy sausage dripping in garum. You didn't ask questions. You ate what was hot and kept walking. But for Rome's middle class, artisans, freedmen, shopkeepers, the street food experience was a little more curated. You could afford better vendors, fresher ingredients, or maybe even a private cook to prepare something warm at home. Some would linger at stalls known for specialty dishes, maybe fried cheese, date pastries, or even grilled cuttlefish if you were feeling bold. You might even sit on a stool. Meanwhile, the upper class had a different relationship with street food. Publicly, they disdained it. A proper Roman aristocrat dined reclining on cushions, waited on by slaves, sipping wine poured from crystal, and nibbling peacock tongues served by someone named Cassius, keeper of the napkin. The very idea of standing at a food stall like a sweaty labourer was scandalous. But here's the twist. They ate it anyway. Senators disguised in cloaks would sneak into the poorer districts after dark to grab roasted chickpeas or buy garum directly from the source. Even the rich couldn't resist a honeyed fritter fresh off the fire. Writers like Marshall and Juvenal mocked the hypocrisy. How the elite shamed the poor for eating food they themselves couldn't stop craving. And let's not forget the slaves. They were at the bottom, yet made up a massive portion of the population. Their meals were whatever they could scavenge, steal, or scrape together. Often leftovers from their masters, or scraps from generous stall owners. But sometimes, just sometimes, they tasted the same fried pancake or sausage as the free citizens. In that moment, class lines blurred, at least on the tongue. In Rome, food wasn't just sustenance, it was theatre, a performance of status, struggle, and survival. If Roman street food was lively on a normal day, during festivals it became pure chaos. Delicious, smoky, wine-soaked chaos. Rome loved a good festival, and by good we mean raucous, over-the-top, all-day affairs where gods were honoured, slaves got drunk, and everyone forgot who owed whom money. There were dozens each year, and with every celebration came a tidal wave of food, flooding the streets faster than the Tiber in spring. During Saturnalia, the December blowout that made Christmas look like a knitting circle, slaves were allowed to eat at the same stalls as their masters. Social rules turned upside down. Vendors roasted entire pigs on spits in the open air, handed out fried pastries, and sold hot wine spiced with pepper and honey. The streets smelled like a butcher's shop, and a bakery had collided, and no one complained. Lupercalia, the rowdy February fertility festival, was equally wild. Young men ran half-naked through the streets, and the food stalls catered accordingly. Hearty fare like blood sausage, fatty cuts of meat, fried chickpeas, and thick bread to soak up all the wine being spilled and consumed in equal measure. Even religious festivals had a gluttonous side. After sacrifices were made at temples, parts of the animal, especially the edible bits, were sold to food vendors or handed out to crowds. Street stalls would take that fresh meat, stew it, fry it, or shove it into bread. It was sacred barbecue, Roman style. Street vendors thrived during these events. It was peak business. They'd work all night, stacking their dolia with stews, pastries, grilled fish, honey cakes, and more. Children begged for sweets. Old men argued over olive fritters, and everyone drank way too much mulsum, the sweet wine that tasted like a headache in progress. Of course, with food came problems. Greedy vendors watered down wine, Meat sometimes went off, but was served anyway. And pickpockets treated crowded stalls like buffets of a different kind. Still, no one seemed to care, at least until the hangover hit. Festivals weren't just about honouring the gods. They were a release valve for a city teetering on the edge of madness. And food was central to it all. Steaming, frying, dripping food, served in clay bowls and eaten with greasy fingers under strings of lanterns. It wasn't just a feast. It was Rome, unbuttoned and unbothered. Roman street food might have kept bellies full and the city humming, but it wasn't all savoury stews and sizzling sausages. Beneath the steam and the shouting lay a darker layer, where food could kill you, cheat you, or land you in serious trouble. Let's start with food fraud. Rome had no health inspectors. If your lentil stew smelled off, that was your problem. Vendors frequently watered down wine, mixed chalk into flour, and used spoiled meat spiced just enough to fool the nose. One common trick was to soak rotten fish in garum and pass it off as fresh. You didn't question the cook. You prayed to Mercury, patron of thieves, and hoped for the best. And the prices? Good luck. Vendors rigged their scales, used crooked ladles, and swapped out ingredients mid-stew. One day you got chickpeas, the next, beans and disappointment. Graffiti from Pompeii even mocked shady food merchants by name, early Yelp reviews, but with more venom and bad spelling. Sometimes the stakes were higher than just indigestion. Street food vendors were notorious for bribing officials to secure the best corners or block their competitors. Fights broke out over stall locations. At least one known riot in the Suburra started because of a food stall dispute. Spoons were flung. Stew was spilled. Somebody lost a tooth over an olive fritter. Then there were the poisons. Yes, real, intentional poisoning. Rome had no shortage of enemies, and food was an easy weapon. More than one senator met his end by drinking wine laced with venom, or eating figs dusted with powdered glass. If you were rich, you travelled with a food taster. If you were poor, well, you just rolled the dice every time you took a bite. And we haven't even mentioned the rats, roaches, and general filth. Most stalls operated next to open sewers. Leftovers were thrown in the street. Dogs, cats, and half-starved slaves fought over scraps like gladiators without swords. Hygiene wasn't just poor, it was a myth. If you didn't develop a strong gut by age 10, you didn't make it to 15. But still, Romans returned every day. The food might be risky, but it was also irresistible. Because in the end, what's a little stomach trouble compared to a hot meatball drenched in garum? You might think Roman street food vanished with the empire, swept away like so much ash and amphorae. But the truth is, those smoky stalls, bubbling pots, and greasy snacks left fingerprints all over modern cuisine. You've probably tasted ancient Rome without even knowing it. Start with the basics. Bread. The flatbreads sold in Roman stalls, not so different from pizza bianca in modern Italy. Add olive oil, garlic, maybe a smear of fermented anchovy paste, and suddenly you're one street vendor away from recreating a first-century lunch. And chickpeas? Still a staple in Mediterranean diets, whether mashed into hummus, baked into farinata, or crisped into modern falafel. The Roman fondness for legumes echoes across time. In fact, pulse, their barley or wheat porridge, isn't far off from modern polenta, or even savoury oatmeal bowls. Then there's garum. While the Roman original hasn't aged well in reputation, its descendants are thriving. Southeast Asian fish sauce, Worcestershire sauce, and even some soy sauces carry the same umami punch. The idea of fermented flavour bombs. The Romans mastered it before it was cool. Even the concept of street food itself, fast, affordable, handheld meals sold from tiny shops, owes something to the thermopolia. The modern food cart, taco stand, or kebab kiosk might look flashier, but the spirit is the same. Hot food, low prices, big flavor, no questions asked. Archaeological sites like Pompeii have given us astonishing glimpses into Roman food culture. Entire food stalls have been unearthed, counters intact, pots still charred, even traces of snails, duck, and beans preserved in ancient cooking vessels. One even had a fresco menu painted above the serving window. The marketing was better than most TikTok ads. And now, chefs and historians alike are reviving Roman recipes. Cookbooks translate Apicius, the Roman foodie emperor, into dishes you can try today. Honey-roasted dormice optional. Modern Rome still serves up dishes that would be familiar to a hungry plebeian. Fried artichokes, herb-infused cheese, flatbreads dripping with oil. The empire may have fallen, the emperors turned to dust. But the flavor? That survived. Because when you bite into something salty, crispy, and wildly comforting at 2 a.m., you're doing what Romans did 2,000 years ago. You're eating history, one greasy handful at a time. In the medieval court, silence was rare. Between clinking goblets, rustling silks, and the occasional jousting injury, there was one constant: music. But not just any music. If you wanted to set the mood for a royal feast, entertain a restless noble, or soften the mood after a political beheading, you called in the minstrels. These weren't background musicians strumming in the corner. Minstrels were the sound engineers of the medieval world. They carried news, recited poetry, performed daring ballads, and even composed sharp satire, sometimes while their audience still held knives. Their instruments? Lutes, harps, flutes, vielle fiddles, and the occasional bagpipe if you really wanted to wake the nobles up. A well-tuned minstrel could turn a boring court dinner into a lyrical battlefield. The medieval court ran on drama and performance, and minstrels were vital to both. They immortalized heroic deeds, real or wildly exaggerated. If a knight slew a dragon, or merely slipped off his horse while trying, they'd craft a song about it. The audience didn't care about truth. They cared about the rhyme. Minstrels weren't just musical. They were verbal magicians. With sharp tongues and clever wordplay, they recited epic tales of doomed lovers, legendary warriors, and tragic betrayals. They could win laughter from a surly lord, or tears from a war-hardened knight. And they knew how to read a room. If the Baron had recently been caught in a scandal, maybe avoid the bawdy satire that night. Their position in the social hierarchy was flexible. Some were beloved fixtures of court life, protected and pampered. Others were treated as glorified jesters, expected to sing for their supper and then sleep in the stables. But all minstrels knew one thing. If you wanted to survive in the royal court, your music had to be more than pretty. It had to be useful. Political flattery, coded gossip, subtle warnings, all disguised in verse. And their power? Immense. Because long before history was written down, it was sung. The noble deeds, the petty rivalries, the courtly romances, all passed from minstrel to minstrel like living folklore. If a noble wanted their legacy remembered, they didn't need a monument. They needed a song. In the end, minstrels didn't just play music. They played memory. When a minstrel walked into a medieval court, they weren't carrying sheet music and a Spotify playlist. They arrived with a portable arsenal of sound, each instrument carefully chosen to charm, mock, or mourn depending on the audience's mood and how drunk the nobles were. The lute reigned supreme. Its pear-shaped body and gentle twang made it perfect for ballads of tragic love and heroic deeds. If you were a knight hoping to impress a lady, or rewrite your battlefield clumsiness into a tale of valor, you wanted a lute player nearby. Then came the harp, not the angelic golden contraption from Renaissance paintings, but a more practical wooden frame strung with gut strings and tuned with the patience of a saint. The harp could be delicate or dramatic. It was often used during ceremonial entrances, romantic interludes, or when a lord wanted to look pensive without doing any actual thinking. Drums and tambourines brought rhythm to the feast. They signaled excitement, battle preparations, or dance-worthy energy when everyone had had too much wine and dignity was already out the window. For something more exotic, there was the vielle, a proto-fiddle with a haunting nasal tone perfect for sorrowful laments or eerie tales. Nothing set the mood like a slow, mournful vielle solo as the fire crackled and someone hinted at court betrayal. Flutes and recorders? Excellent for lively dances or whimsical background tunes. Even bagpipes had their place, mostly in the courts of the Celtic and northern regions, loved by locals, loathed by everyone else. And then there were the vocals. A minstrel's voice was their most important instrument. Trained not in conservatories, but in crowded markets and echoing halls, these voices had to cut through noise, wine-induced heckling, and the occasional thrown chicken bone. They could mimic accents, chant in Latin, croon in courtly French, or bark out satire in the local dialect, all while keeping tempo with a drum or plucking a stringed instrument. Each performance was a delicate dance between music and message. A wrong note could bore the audience. A wrong lyric could offend a noble. But when played right, the minstrel became the heartbeat of the evening. Instruments were more than wood and string. They were tools of persuasion, power, and survival. To the untrained eye, a medieval minstrel might have looked like courtly background noise, a tuneful distraction while nobles drank themselves into forgetfulness. But their true role? Much deeper. Minstrels were the medieval court's emotional regulators, public relations officers, political commentators, and memory keepers, all under the guise of a song. Minstrels didn't just play music, they shaped moods. A tense court gathering could be softened by a well-placed ballad. A queen's boredom could be lifted with a romantic chanson. And when a knight returned from a campaign, the minstrel was already composing verses before the mud was even dry on his boots. They were also historians, of a sort. In a world with limited literacy and fewer books than battle scars, minstrels were the living archives. Their songs preserved family lineages, battles won, scandals hushed, and marriages brokered. If your name made it into a minstrel's song, you were halfway to medieval immortality. But it wasn't all flattery and flowers. Minstrels could bite. Court satire was a subtle art, roasting lords in rhyme, veiling insults in clever metaphors. A good minstrel knew exactly how far to push before a noble's chuckle turned into a glare. Some minstrels, particularly those who travelled court to court, became famous for their sharp wit and scandalous verse, verbal tightrope walkers balancing between applause and execution. They also served a diplomatic role. Visiting courts often brought their own musicians as part of their delegation. These performances weren't just for fun. They were displays of cultural sophistication, soft power, and mutual respect. A poorly received performance could sour a political deal. A hauntingly beautiful lament might win favour where words had failed. Even in times of mourning, minstrels had a place. Funerals for nobles often featured carefully composed dirges, meant not just to grieve, but to elevate the deceased's legacy through song. The higher the status, the grander the lament, and the greater the pressure not to hit a wrong note. Some minstrels became trusted confidants. Royals with few people to trust might whisper secrets to the bard, knowing they could encode truths in verses that would only be understood by those who listened closely. In the medieval court, the minstrel wasn't just playing music, they were playing the room. And in a world ruled by politics, pride, and performance that made them indispensable. Not all medieval musicians were created equal. While modern ears might lump them all together as minstrels, medieval courts were far more particular. Titles mattered, and so did origins. In the echoing halls of royalty, the difference between a troubadour and a jongleur could mean a seat at the banquet, or a night with the pigs. Let's start at the top. The troubadours. Originating in the courts of Occitania, southern France, troubadours were poet-composers who wrote and performed their own lyrical masterpieces. They sang in Occitan, the language of courtly love, and their songs often revolved around noble passion, unrequited longing, and the spiritual torment of seeing a duchess married to a man twice her age. Think of them as medieval singer-songwriters with a flair for dramatic heartbreak. Troubadours weren't beggars. Many were nobly born, some even knights, which gave them access to elite courts and patronage. They weren't expected to juggle or dance. They dealt in poetry and subtlety. A good troubadour could turn a simple lute tune into a philosophical dilemma about love, honour, and social class. Below them, you had the trouvères, their northern cousins. Same idea, but they sang in Old French, and their themes leaned a little more martial. Knights, crusades, and heroic tales. Less longing glances, more heads getting lopped off in the name of glory. Then came the jongleurs, the real workhorses of medieval entertainment. Jongleurs were versatile, mobile, and usually far less refined. They juggled, played multiple instruments, sang borrowed songs, told dirty jokes, recited gossip, and sometimes even trained animals. If the troubadour was your elegant wine bar performer, the jongleur was the guy playing the fiddle in the back of the pub. Rowdy, unpredictable, and occasionally brilliant. Jongleurs travelled court to court, town to town, living off tips and scraps. While they lacked the prestige of the troubadours, they had street smarts, and they could read a crowd like a book. If a noble wanted a discreet insult hurled at a rival, the jongleur was the man for the job. Despite their differences, troubadours and jongleurs often worked together. One would compose, the other perform. One praised a countess's eyes. The other roasted her husband's bald spot. In the great symphony of medieval courts, each musician had a role to play. Harmony was optional. Drama guaranteed. If you thought medieval songs were all about chivalry and rose gardens, think again. Minstrels might have worn tunics and played lutes, but their lyrics could cut deeper than any sword. Behind the melodies were sharp observations, bawdy jokes, romantic fantasies, and enough political subtext to make a king sweat. Let's start with love songs, the bread and butter of the court musician. But this wasn't just, "I love you, marry me" stuff. Oh no. Courtly love was an emotional maze of longing, restraint, and poetic suffering. The troubadour would profess undying devotion to a lady usually married to someone more important, and ideally, someone less poetic. The object of desire remained unattainable, because the real thrill wasn't in the conquest, it was in the agony. Emotional pain, but make it fashionable. Songs would describe the beloved's eyes like twin stars, her touch like sunlight, her voice like church bells, or if the poet was in a bad mood, like a goose in distress. These metaphors walked a fine line between flattery and melodrama, and audiences lapped it up. But not all songs were so refined. Satirical songs were the medieval version of late-night comedy. They poked fun at lords who overate, priests who misbehaved, and knights who had more brawn than brain. Minstrels mastered the art of the roast, veiling insults in clever rhymes and regional dialects. Everyone laughed, unless they were the target. In that case, a sharp exit was advised. Then there were the scandal songs, whispered from court to court like lyrical wildfire. These were the TMZ reports of the Middle Ages, melodies that hinted at affairs, betrayals, and quiet disappearances. A well-timed verse could suggest that Lady Eleanor was spending too much time with her squire, without ever saying it outright. The beauty of it? Plausible deniability. If the offended noble objected, the minstrel would simply bow and say, "Your Grace, it's only a song." These songs weren't written down often. They lived orally, passed from one performer to the next, morphing with every retelling. What started as a romantic lament in one court might become biting satire by the time it reached the next. Whether praising a duchess, mocking a bishop, or exposing a royal fling, minstrels used their songs to dance between adoration and outrage. In the court, a clever verse could be more dangerous than a dagger. In the medieval court, entertainment wasn't just something to pass the time. It was a calculated display of power, wealth, and taste. And no royal gathering was complete without minstrels weaving sound into the scene, one pluck, breath, and rhyme at a time. Banquets were their prime stage. Imagine it, a great hall decked in banners, torches crackling on stone walls, nobles reclining on cushioned benches, their goblets full, their tempers higher than the ceiling beams. And then, rising above the chatter, a lute strums. A voice follows. The feast hushes. The real performance begins. Minstrels knew how to work a room. Their sets weren't random. They followed the rhythm of the evening. A light-hearted jig to start, lift spirits and calm nerves. Then a tale of war, loyalty, or betrayal, dramatic enough to get everyone's attention, but not so serious that the Baron chokes on his pheasant. Toward the end, a bawdy tune or two, just risque enough to make the duchesses blush behind their fans. They weren't alone either. Minstrels often performed alongside jugglers, acrobats, or even trained animals. A good feast might feature a harp solo followed by a monkey doing cartwheels. That's what passed for variety programming in the 12th century. In royal courts, music had another function: political mood lighting. Hosting a visiting noble, cue a song about their family's glorious deeds, need to distract from rising taxes, bring in a jongleur with a scandalous new ditty. Was the king's temper dangerously short? Time for a soothing ballad about loyalty, heroism, and not executing people today. Feast entertainment also doubled as propaganda. Minstrels sang of the king's military victories, embellished, of course, and glossed over the losses. Songs reminded the nobility of their duty, their honour, and their place beneath the monarch's well-shined boot. For the audience, this was more than fun. It was social theatre. Laughing too loudly at a satirical verse could be dangerous. Failing to applaud a song praising the Queen? Suspicious. Knowing the right moments to nod, chuckle, or sigh was part of noble etiquette. Minstrels walked a tightrope. They performed to amuse but also to influence. And their stage. It wasn't just a hall. It was a minefield of egos, secrets, and strategy. And they played it like pros. While most history books shout about knights and kings, the women behind the music of the medieval court often sang in whispers, quiet, poetic, but unforgettable. Though barred from many positions of formal power, some women carved out spaces in the courtly soundscape, turning melody into subtle influence. Enter the Trobairites, female counterparts to the famous troubadours of southern France. These women weren't simply muses or background singers. They were poets, composers, and performers in their own right, often writing verses that challenged traditional gender roles and expectations. Their songs spoke of love, yes, but from the woman's perspective. Longing, anger, resistance, empowerment. It was courtly love with a sharp edge. The Trebarets might sing of a lover who broke his vow, or of the constraints placed on women by marriage and status. Their lyrics offered a rare glimpse into the interior lives of medieval noblewomen, lives typically locked behind tapestries and etiquette. Then there were the noblewomen who supported and hosted minstrels. Queens and ladies of the court often acted as patrons, commissioning works to celebrate weddings, births, alliances, or just their own egos. Some even learned to play instruments like the harp or psaltery, performing in private salons or ladies' chambers, where songs became both entertainment and emotional outlet. Women also featured prominently as subjects in songs, idealized, romanticized, criticized. But here too, some minstrels pushed boundaries. They wrote bawdy verses from female perspectives, satirical ballads about possessive husbands, or odes to widows who refused to remarry. These weren't just performances. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Outside noble courts, in the more raucous world of travelling minstrels and street performers, women often joined troupes as singers, dancers, or comedic foils. They were bold, charismatic, and often underpaid. But their presence was essential, especially in festivals and fairs, where their voices added depth and scandal to the performance. Of course, the church wasn't thrilled. Female performers were often labelled immoral or dangerous, and many were barred from sacred spaces or dismissed as temptresses. But even so, they sang on. Because music gave them a voice when society offered none. And though many of their names have been lost, their songs, fragmented, haunting, defiant, echo still, like harps played behind stone walls. Not every minstrel was lucky enough to strum a lute beneath a chandelier or get paid in gold by a duke with a wine problem. Many worked the roads, wandering from town to town, castle to castle, market to marketplace, in search of an audience, a bed, and preferably food that wasn't moving. These itinerant minstrels were the lifeblood of medieval musical culture. Unlike their court-attached counterparts, they had no steady patron, no fancy banquet schedule, and no guarantees. They survived on skill, wit, and a keen understanding of crowd psychology. If a village liked tragic ballads, you sang sorrow. If they preferred jokes about flatulent monks, you held your nose and gave the people what they wanted. Their tools were portable, small harps, fiddles, tambourines, hand flutes. Some travelled with animals, dancing bears, dogs in hats, monkeys trained to steal purses. A few doubled as healers, conmen, or message bearers. Many slept in barns, inns, or under the stars, protected only by the popularity of their most recent song. These minstrels weren't just performers. They were the internet of their day. They carried news from distant lands, stories of war, songs from other courts, and gossip that could unseat a baron. A clever wandering bard could turn heads with a fresh tune, and cause serious discomfort in castle halls if the lyrics hinted at secrets too close to home. Despite their humble image, many of these performers were incredibly skilled. Some had trained at court before falling out of favour. Others learned on the road, absorbing styles, languages, and melodies across regions. They were musical chameleons, shifting between dialects and instruments like diplomats in disguise. Their audiences ranged from peasants gathered around a festival fire to minor lords hosting impromptu feasts. Sometimes they were welcomed warmly. Other times, especially if they sang something too spicy, They were run out of town with more bruises than coins. But still, they travelled. Because for many minstrels, the road was more than a necessity. It was freedom. No fixed allegiance, no lords to flatter or betray. Just music, movement, and the endless hope that the next town might bring a better stage, a fuller purse, or at the very least, a bed that didn't bite. They weren't just performers. They were messengers, memory keepers, and map makers of the human heart. As the medieval era gave way to the Renaissance, the minstrel's world began to fade, but it never disappeared. The courts grew more refined. Composers wrote sheet music instead of singing tales from memory. Professional musicians replaced wandering bards. But the legacy of the minstrels? It stuck like a melody you can't forget. In many ways, the minstrels laid the groundwork for the modern artist. They understood rhythm, audience, and storytelling. They turned gossip into verse, heartbreak into harmony, and politics into poetic jabs. Their craft was a living thing, part song, part social commentary, part survival instinct. Their influence ran deep. The troubadour tradition echoed in Renaissance madrigals. Folk songs passed from peasant lips to printed ballads. Themes of courtly love, noble sacrifice, and cheeky rebellion carried into the works of poets like Chaucer and Shakespeare. Even the early operas of Italy, soaring, dramatic, full of passion, owed something to those dusty medieval performances in drafty great halls. And while the courts became more exclusive and music more formalized, the spirit of the minstrel simply moved elsewhere, into town squares, into travelling theatre, into taverns where fiddlers played tunes older than the walls around them, into the hearts of people who still told stories through sound. Today, we still see their echoes. Street performers who juggle, sing, and flirt with the crowd. That's pure jongleur energy. Singer-songwriters bearing their soul over a guitar. Troubadours in modern clothing. Political satire in lyrical form. The minstrels would be proud. Even fantasy literature and films, anything with castles, knights, and someone strumming a lute in the corner, owe a debt to these figures. They're the unsung glue of medieval imagination, holding together stories of heroism and hilarity, romance and ridicule. And despite centuries of change, one thing remains. People still crave melody. We still gather to listen, to feel, to be told who we are, whether by Spotify playlist or by a harp played under torchlight. The minstrels may be gone, their verses scattered like parchment in the wind. But their legacy? It sings on. In every performance that dares to entertain, enlighten, or provoke, a medieval minstrel is smiling quietly in the wings.